Lights, camera, action. Today, we have with us on Conversations with Charlie, Brad Anderson, a veteran filmmaker, director, writer, editor, a true filmmaker. It's our pleasure and my pleasure to invite on Conversations with Charlie, Brad Anderson. How you doing, buddy?
I'm good, Charlie. Happy to be here. As you know, we go way back,
Yes, we do.
kind of way back to the days
Like,
of Boston.
yeah, the 90s, the mid 90s, maybe even the early 90s, if
Yeah, many
we really wind the clock back.
I think it is. I think it's kind of early 90s.
Correct.
Yeah.
But and we'll swim back there, but I want to start with
Yeah.
what's going on right now. What's happening in the life of you as we speak?
Well, currently I'm up at my beautiful upstate New York, Hudson Valley, little cabin in the woods where I come to retreat away from family and madness, and sometimes do a little work up here, do some writing. It's my little kind of away place. And I've been up here, since finishing some TV episodes. Since COVID, it's been a lot of television, frankly, episodic television. I tend to split my time between doing the TV stuff and doing trying to get the movies off the ground, right? The independent features.
Yeah.
So, I mean, currently I'm in between projects, as they say. I just finished a Netflix show, and before that, I was doing a thing for HBO Max, and before that, doing something for one of the networks. So I'm kind of going, kind of across the board, working. Love to stay busy. I don't like to just sit on my haunches. I like to kind of always be working. It just keeps me going. I love doing it, right?
Mhm.
So, when I'm not working like behind the camera directing, I'm writing something or trying to find a way to corral money to get a movie off the ground, so kind of always in a place of doing one or two of those things.
Right. And tell me about these current episodic projects and how they found you. I mean, obviously, you've done so much episodic going back to, I mean, you did The Wire, and I mean, you've been doing this a lot of years, right? Yeah.
I have, yeah. I mean, TV kind of kicked in, television directing kicked in for me, early when I first kind of got into the business, if you will, after my first couple movies kind of got a little traction. My first TV episode I ever did was an episode of Homicide, actually.
Mhm.
Barry Levinson's show. And yeah, I did The Wire and many other episodes since then. I have how do I get them? I mean, like anyone, I've got my agents who work for me on the TV ends of things and also on the film ends of things. I've been doing, the thing I love doing more than just simply an episode of a show, of an ongoing show or a new show, is doing the pilot, kind of launching the show, creating it. It's as close as you can get to doing a movie because you're doing all the bells and whistles, casting it, finding the look of the show. You're creating the show from the ground up. But that's really my preference. But as I said, COVID put a little monkey wrench in things over the past year and a half. So it's just starting to pick up now in a pretty good way. Like there's a lot of work coming down the pike, but for a while there, it was just kind of like grab it while you can, because there wasn't as much going on, and you had to go to Canada and quarantine for 2 weeks, and it was a big drag. But so I just I'm always seeking out different projects. I like doing when I'm doing television. I like doing stuff that's not always in my wheelhouse, like stuff I tests my limits as a director and as a creator. Like I did an episode of the show called Peacemaker, which is a new HBO Max show with John Cena, which is like kind of like it's a superhero show. James Gunn's the creator of the show, right? He did Suicide Squad. So it's crazy. It's kooky. It's like big action
Is it
sequences.
sort of part of the Marvel world and all that, or DC Comics? I think
DC,
DC
yeah.
Comics. Yeah.
It's DC, but it's but yeah, it's superhero stuff, right? But in his own, I mean, James Gunn's stuff tends to be a little more tongue in cheek, so it's not straight up the line superhero stuff. but I did an episode of that, which was really fun, different, like that's not necessarily my thing, but as a director, it's always fun to jump into genres that aren't necessarily your thing, to try your hand at other sorts of things, dramatic things, whether it's a comedy or a hospital show or whatever, So the show I just did was a new Netflix show called Devil in Ohio, which is kind of a dark sort of thriller about kids getting sucked into cults. I tend to gravitate towards darker things, tends to be my thing, at least has been for some time now.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you go way back, you kind of started off with a couple of rom-coms really before you dug your teeth into going the other direction. I'm always fascinated by the beginnings because you started doing everything. You were a director, a writer, but you're also the editor. And I mean, I think you were almost like playing every base on the field when you began, right? I mean, you were truly like the entire thing, right? You were cutting.
You're right.
Yeah.
But that's by virtue of having not knowing enough people in the business early on to be able to do those jobs for me. So I was just sort of jumping on and doing it yourself kind of thing,
Yeah.
I mean, I've always been of the mind that like, if I can't do it, I mean, you have to learn to delegate as a director and surround yourself by people who really know what they're doing, obviously, but you also want to know what those people are doing in your own mind and know how it works and how the whole creative process works. So I like to think of myself more as a filmmaker rather than simply a film director, because I do like to dabble in all parts of, particularly the editing, particularly the post-production side of things. I love that. Like that's a blast, as like just getting into the cutting and all the different elements that come into finishing a movie.
Yeah.
My first movie was, again, just like soup to nuts. Wrote it, directed it, edited it. Didn't act in it. That's one part I never do claim to want to do, but pretty much all the other parts of the process. And then going out and trying to sell it and get it out there into the world. Like that's a whole nother sort of side of the equation, which is I've learned a little bit more about over the years, like the business side of things, you got to learn that. It takes time, but eventually you kind of figure it out.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for you, it's like if going back, I mean, what drew you the most to filmmaking as a writer creator, and then being able to transition from that to being a hired hand with someone else's work? And how do you work with the people who write and you come on and direct? Because I know that you had a very strong initiative starting out as a writer director, and yet the craft, as we well know, is being able to interpret the writing of others and working with other people. Yeah,
it's good to be able to have both skills. I mean, my first few films were movies I originated on my own. I wrote the scripts or co-wrote the scripts, and very much in keeping with the sort of independent film scene in the mid to throughout the 90s, right? It was just kind of like guerrilla style filmmaking. You finance it on a credit card, you write it, you direct it, you cast your friends in it, that kind of thing, right? That was the original. That's how I got into this. So the idea of like being hired to direct another person's script seemed very alien to me. But eventually I came around to doing that. And, a first film I did that I hadn't written was The Machinist, which was written by Scott Kosar. And that experience was like, I gravitated towards scripts that I felt like I could have written, and I felt very connected to the stories. That's why I was interested in doing that. And I always find a way to work with a writer on a project where I can feel like I can own it a little bit and not, go in and do a pass on my own to sort of bring it more into my sensibilities. That's sort of a part of the process that I've always done in my movies. If I haven't written them, I kind of get under the hood a little bit and tinker with it, because makes it feel like I own it a little bit more. But I like that process. As you said, interpreting knowing how to interpret another person's vision and make it your own, or kind of collaborate with that person, is a very kind of critical part of the process, and enjoyable, and like frankly often gives you better results, because you have someone to play off of. You have a sounding board. You can, when you're being stupid, they can tell you, and vice versa. Whereas if it's just you in the room, you think you're a genius. You're not. You know what I mean? So I think having a collaborator in that process, in the writing process, and then even down the road, is critical. I think maybe the only part of the process where you don't is sort of when you're directing, although that collaboration is with the cast, right? And you're kind of like working together with them to sort of find a character. And so, but I enjoy I enjoy both writing as well as, finding scripts that I like enough to want to find a way to get them made.
Yeah, I mean, going back to when you did Happy Accident, you got a chance to really do so much fun stuff. And then you moved over in the Machinist, like to working in, this was in Barcelona with producers from Europe. How did that happen? Tell me a little bit about how that, because I remember hearing about you doing it from, I guess, bumping into you, but I never really knew the story about how you ended up doing this film in Barcelona. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that came out of, my first couple movies, as you said, were romantic comedies that I wrote, in the sort of mid to late 90s. And that was kind of how I got my start in some ways. My first, my second movie got picked up by Miramax. If you want to talk about that, we can talk about that. But basically, I then, wanted to try my hand at a darker tone. And I made a film called Section 9, which was a dark, horror film, essentially set at a mental hospital up in Boston.
Yeah.
That movie has gone on to become kind of like a bit of a cult film. But at the time, it got a lot of people in Europe really loved that movie, and there was a Spanish film company in Barcelona that really adored it and wanted to work with me. And I so happened to have been working with Scott on The Machinist, the script, and we were trying to get the movie financed here in the States, The Machinist, trying to finance here in America, but no one was going for it, even with Christian Bale attached. This is before Christian Bale became who he is, but eventually this company, Filmax in Barcelona, said, yeah, we'll do it. The only thing is you have to shoot it here in Spain. The movie, if you've ever seen it, is set in not Spain. It's set in some kind of quasi American, somewhat surreal reality. It seems like it's California, but it's not really. It's kind of a weird fever dream type American city. I don't really know where it's set. And in some ways, like by shooting in Barcelona and by trying to make Barcelona into some kind of West Coast American city, it kind of added to the weird dreamlikeness of the movie. It actually worked to our advantage. But initially I was like, how are we going to make this movie, which Scott had set in Los Angeles, in Barcelona? It just seems impossible. But I went over there, we did a scout, we checked it out, we looked at various locations, and we decided that there was a way to make it work. So yeah, we shot the film in Barcelona. It was not a bad place to make a movie. I mean, come on, it's best food in the world, lovely people. Have built a relationship with that company after.
Yeah, you did, right? You did another film with them, Trans-Siberian, right?
Trans-Siberian, yeah, and we've tried to get other movies off the ground since. So I have a really nice connection now with Spain. Know a lot of great people. Some of the crew people that worked on The Machinist ended up working on a few of my other movies. So it's become kind of like a real favorite place of mine. So yeah, I mean, but The Machinist was again in keeping with this in my career, not really having, when you're in the midst of a career, you're not thinking about necessarily how to what the direction of it's going to go. You just do what you want to do. You do what you love. You do what your passion drives you to do. So I had fallen out of the interest of doing sort of romantic comedies and more kind of like sweet music driven, like relationship movies, and wanted to do stuff that was darker and grittier. And has always been an interest of mine. not straight out horror, but more psychological horror, right, or psychological drama. So
Yeah.
that kind of started that venture into those sorts of that sort of tonality in terms of the films I've done. The Machinist kind of was the break, or the Session 9 really was the moment of sort of moving in a different direction. You know, and I always think as a filmmaker, you want to also not be tied into one kind of movie or one kind of genre. I mean, you know, I've tried to mix it up in the movies that I've done since then. I mean, I've done different kinds of films, and each one is its own sort of challenge, you know, creating a world, whether it's a period world or a movie set in Beirut or something in the 80s, like finding a way to like kind of, you know, tell a story in a different way. Like that's always been interesting to me, and not tell it in the same way.
Yeah. Well, talk to me about Beirut that you just mentioned, how that came about. That was an interesting turn for you. I like that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, like a different kind of movie. I hadn't done, you know, sort of essentially kind of a political thriller, if you will.
Exactly.
But it came out of, I guess, filmmakers or directors or whatever, or producers who've seen my other movies, who's been interested in working with me. That one was Tony Gilroy, who wrote the script. He had seen Trans-Siberian and really loved it, and sent me a project of his, like, because he couldn't get it made. He had written Beirut back in the early '90s,
Hmm.
And was to direct himself. Or no, actually, no. I think John Frankenheimer at one point was attached to direct it. It's like it had this weird circuitous path, and
Interesting.
ultimately ended up on a shelf gathering dust for over 12, 15 years. He dusted it off and brought it to me, and or one of the producers attached brought it to me with Tony's blessing, and like said, "Are you interested in this project?" And of course, I think Tony Gilroy is like an amazing writer and a
Oh
great
yeah.
director. And it was like the opportunity to actually, you know, create or work on a movie with him in some ways, was cool. And also just the story was really unique and fresh. And as I said, I hadn't done it much like that, but I love the idea of the adventure of going to a place, and in that movie recreating war-torn Beirut, you know, circa 1980. Like, what would that be like? How would we do it on a real logistical level? And it also just had a great sort of, you know, lots of curves in the story. And so I love the challenge of it. So anyhow, that movie came out of Tony's, you know, kind of giving his blessing to sort of get his script off the ground. We were able to get John Hamm attached, and Rosamund Pike, and we're able to get the movie made. We shot it in Morocco, Tangier. That was our substitute for Beirut in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't do it in Beirut. I mean, Beirut's now like a super modern city, and also maybe dangerous.
Yeah.
So that movie was again a kind of reinvention for me. But I love that genre too. I mean, it reminded me a little bit of one of my favorite movies, The Year Living Dangerously, the Peter Weir movie.
Oh, I love that film.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of my touchstone, like this sort of exotic thriller set in a faraway land where this dude's trying to, like, you know, negotiate his way through all this political turmoil. And it kind of, there's a little bit of a romance there too as well. And like that kind of idea of like just doing something in that way out of my wheelhouse was really cool.
Yeah.
I mean, so I always like jump at those opportunities to, you know, embark on an adventure that's takes me to someplace I've never been before too. Like, I love that part of it. It's fun.
And then when you did Fractured with Sam Worthington, that came about more recently, right? I mean, talk to me a little bit about Fractured.
So that movie was a movie that was brought to me by the producers, who again just thought I'd be a good fit for it. And it was a Netflix movie. Netflix was producing that movie. I'd never done anything with Netflix before, so the opportunity of doing something, as we all are doing now in the streaming world, was exciting. And I dug the story. It's very dark. It's very much like, you know, earlier films of mine, like The Machinist or Session 9. It's super twisty and weird. And it deals with like, it's a movie that deals with a guy who's like questioning the reality around him in a way, or what's real and what's delusional. So I love those kind of stories that walk that line. And it was very contained. It was all set in a hospital, so it was like really doable. And anyhow, so that was Netflix that got me on board that movie. We got Sam attached, and we shot that movie up in Winnipeg, in Canada, which has now become like a kind of go-to place for cheap filmmaking.
This is what I've heard.
Yeah, it's off the beaten path, but it's kind of a cool place. I did another movie there recently, my last movie actually. So, Fractured was my first experience dealing with that kind of world, the Netflix. And oddly enough, there was a big success for them. I mean, their metrics for measuring like how a movie does, of course, are very different than how a studio measures it. But when they kind of released the movie on the Friday night at 11:59, like they do, it got a lot of hits, a lot of eyeballs, a lot of people saw that movie on Netflix, and so that was really gratifying. But in some weird way, it was also my first sort of understanding that you don't have the kind of sense of completion that you have when you make a movie that hits the theaters and it's out there, and then it's, what I mean, it has a sort of feeling of more, it feels more sort of grounded in a way. The streaming experience with your movie is just kind of like, oh, there it is, okay, people are watching it, I guess. You know what I mean? It's hard to kind of get a sense as to like how a movie's doing, but regardless,
it's hanging in the portfolio of what's available to watch.
Yeah,
rather than being on a marquee.
Yeah, it comes up in your little gallery or whatever of like things that are recommended. But yeah, I mean, that was a cool experience. I actually really like that movie. It's very twisted, but and so that movie gave me some connections at Netflix. And then I went on after that to do a pilot for them called Clickbait, which was also a big hit for them. That came out last year, or this past year. So yeah, sort of like that's how often these things work, right? Like one project kind of finds a way to dovetail into the next because of a relationship or whatever, like it's like a kind of swervy way to do it, but I kind of enjoy finding the next project sort of in that way. It's more surprising. Suddenly you'll be finding yourself doing a movie that you had no idea that was, in the cards, and it's exciting.
Yeah. And a whole slew of series television, as you described, from having done Homicide and The Wire all the way through to current day. I mean, I remember seeing, because when I was working still in the lab, seeing your name on the slate of episodes of yeah. Well, hey,
yeah,
we used to shoot film. Remember that?
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah. Great. Saw my name on the slate. Nice.
In Boardwalk Empire, I was like,
all right,
oh my God, Brad's directing Boardwalk Empire. How fabulous is this? That had to be an incredible experience. Talk to me about that.
That was really fun. I mean, that might have been the last thing I did on film, frankly.
It was all film.
Shot that on film. I don't think that was around the time that television was starting to move away from film and everyone was shooting digital, right?
Exactly right. 2010, 2011. Exactly.
Right. Transition. Now it's a bit of a mixed bag. There's a little bit of both, but mostly it's not film anymore. But that was great. I mean, what a great, cool world to, again, like 1920s New York, Brooklyn, like that world of like gangsters and, it was just a fascinating kind of period, and to get the opportunity to sort of dive into that. I mean, they had that amazing set, the Boardwalk set over in Williamsburg. I think it was Williamsburg, where the giant like pier that was jutting out into the East River that they had converted into a boardwalk set, with big green screens for doing digital extensions. And like the wardrobe department was like literally almost like an entire stage at Steiner Studios, just like with every 1920s style wardrobe you can imagine, all the hats and everything. It was incredible. So it was like so fun, you know, because it was like so unusual, not necessarily the thing I would ever do if it weren't a television show, you know.
Right.
And working with, you know, just great actors who many of, you know, went on to great things, and of course, you know, Steve Buscemi, and really cool experience. And HBO is always like, you know, that's sort of like the Cadillac of television when you get those gigs, because they've got a much more in the terms of money that goes into their projects, into their episodes, and they don't hold back. So you just kind of have everything at your disposal. It's just like great.
And on a show like that, and I think probably with all series TV, you're working as one director amongst 5, 6 different directors sometimes on a series like that. I don't know how many directors there were on Boardwalk, but there were quite a few. Am I correct? So episode to episode, and
Right.
is there any experience that you have? I've never talked to any of the other directors that worked on Boardwalk other than the show creator, because we worked when I, you know, did the pilot that Marty directed and was shot by Stu
Okay.
Triberg. You know, there's a theme created, and then after that, multiple directors come in to take over. So what's that handoff like? And is there a discussion between directors and between other artists that are on the job, or you just come in and you know sort of what needs to be done for the episode, and there's not much of a collaboration or handoff from the other many directors that are on the show?
There's not much collaboration with the other directors. Now, first of all, yes, without mostly generally like a series like that will have multiple directors who come in to do different episodes.
Yeah.
It used to, you know, whether it's a network show or a cable show, you know, unless it's like a certain kind of mini series where one director will do all episodes, but that's becoming more of a thing. But generally with like a long running series, you'll have multiple directors coming in. It used to be you do an episode and you walk away. Now they tend to break it into blocks. So you do a couple episodes, you know, like the Netflix thing I just did. I did 2 episodes back to back. And that's just so that they can kind of get more bang for their buck when you're doing it, right?
Mhm.
But yeah, you come in and you're the guy for those episodes. There's generally a, you know, it's a bit of a learning curve, because you have to sort of learn the show and learn the vibe of the show, not just, you know, the look of it and the feel of it and the tone of it, but also just like the where the characters are and their trajectory, so you know what the hell you're talking about when you're on set, right? So you usually watch all the other episodes as much as you can. If you know, if you're doing episode 6, you watch the prior episodes, try to get a handle on it, and then you have multiple discussions with the showrunner, the creator, and there's usually a supervising director whose job it is to kind of like squire the different directors through the process and help them sort of understand what's going on, what's happening. So you're not just like thrown into it and expected to like deliver. So, but you know, so each episode, every time you do a television show, you're kind of learning a template of, or you're learning a little style for that show that you then kind of apply to your episode as much as you can. You're not going to reinvent the wheel, right? It's like if the show shot all handheld, like say Homicide was back in the day, then you're not going to come in and throw it on the dolly for every shot. On the other sense, with Boardwalk, it was a very kind of meticulously designed show, so you didn't do a lot of handheld. So you find a way to kind of stylistically adapt to the show, and then you kind of you jump in, and then once you're in it, you know, they don't hire directors just to simply, you know, yell action and cut. Like they want them to bring a vision to the show, even if the show already has its overarching vision. So, you know, Martin Scorsese did the pilot. Like they want, for each episode subsequent to that, they want to bring in directors who are gonna riff off of what he did and continue this quality of filmmaking. Not all shows. I mean, there's some shows which are more, you dial it in, frankly, because it's like there isn't much of a style, you know, like that Boardwalk Empire was a very high bar. Like, you know, if you had someone like Marty Scorsese doing the pilot, like you're gonna damn well make sure you keep that quality going. Other shows don't really have aren't as discriminating. But I tend to like gravitate and want to do shows that are better than that are good shows, that I'd watch, shows that like have a certain style or substance to them. So that was one, like with Boardwalk. And but yeah, it's definitely sometimes weird coming to set on day one, and like the director who did the prior episode is leaving, and you're kind of, it's like, yeah, he or she is passing the baton to you, and you're kind of like, okay, jump right in. You can't sort of have second thoughts about it.
Oh
I
no.
think it's good for the actors though, because they like having fresh blood. You know what I mean? Like people that can kind of come in and shake it up a little bit in terms of how the set is run or how they're directed. I mean, they might have certain directors they favor over others, but it keeps it interesting, and you don't kind of get into rote, just like this is how each episode is made. It's like it makes it kind of different. So I think from the showrunner's perspective, having different directors come in for different episodes helps keep the show engaging and not falling into like kind of like a rut, visually and stuff.
And when you worked with Halle Berry on The Caller, talk a little bit about the 911 show, The Call.
Yeah.
That was that
Like
looked
we're
like
doing right now, The Call.
that looked like an interesting one. She looked like a real freak show of a story with like all of the components of racing to figure something out. Yeah.
That was a fun, that was actually that movie came out of another script that had been floating around for some time, trying to get made, and had different directors attached, but ultimately I came on board, and we made that movie, not for a lot of money. It wasn't a big movie. Halle did it because she just loved the idea of playing that character. It was something she had never done before, that kind of a character.
Mhm.
And the thing about that film, which is, it's sort of like it's like, it's a real kind of like pulse pounding, like nonstop kind of action film, which is, to me, was like, I hadn't really done that before. So having a chance to do something that's really driven by action, visual action, and horror too, it's pretty horrific, was really fun and exciting. And that movie, that's actually been on a just a purely monetary level, that's been my most successful film. That movie did really well, much better than it had been anticipated. And it was, tried to get a sequel going, and for some reason it didn't come together. But yeah, that was and when I did the film, we like I said, we didn't make the movie it was sort of a middle to low budget film, but I brought on a lot of people I'd worked with in the business, like Tom Yatska, my director of photography, I'd done a lot of television with. So I brought a lot of TV people in that I'd been working with, because I knew that in order to do it at the budget that we had to work quick, and we had to work like efficiently, like you do on television. Like we weren't just going to be sitting on our butts. And so it has that kind of like energy that, a show like 24 might have, you know what I mean? And that's what we were aiming for. And I think it succeeded in that level, because, we had to make it quick and down and dirty, but still give it like, the elevated thrillerness that we wanted to give it. And yeah, so that movie, that movie was a quite big movie for me. And yeah, I dug that one. It opened up a lot of doors for me, actually. Just because
And it was
when the movie makes money, people start ringing your bell, right?
You start calling, and right after that was it Stone? What was it? The Stone
Asylum.
Asylum, yeah. It was Mel Gibson's company did that, Icon, right? And that was
They were, it was them and Millennium,
yeah.
Mark Gill's company. Mark Gill was the director, or the executive. That movie came out of The Call, because they called me because they wanted to. I had known Mark since Mark was one of the guys at Miramax who bought my first movie, Next Stop Wonderland.
Yeah.
He came. He said, "Well, would you be interested in doing a movie with us? This is Millennium Films. These are the guys who do the big, like the Expendables and those big movies with
Right.
like,
Exactly.
yeah, and so anyhow, this was a script they had floating around, which was kind of this beautiful little story based on an Edgar Allan Poe short story about, kind of the lunatics taking over the asylum kind of gag, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Set in the late 1800s. It was, based on a Poe story. And the original title was called Eliza Graves, which was a much better title. They changed it because they did, but and so it was sort of this sort of love story set among people at an asylum, and at a remote Gothic asylum. So it was a fun movie, very challenging because again, period and big cast for that one. We shot that movie in Bulgaria because that's where Millennium Films has a studio.
They have their stages. They have their stages in Sofia.
Yeah, in Sofia, and they have huge stages, and they can build things for a dime there. Like you could build a whole asylum for like nothing because their construction is so cheap. So that was one of the reasons we shot there, and also most of the movie is inside the asylum, so it was a lot of sets that we built. And that movie was, it was. We got a good cast. Ben Kingsley was in it. Michael Caine made a cameo. We had, Jim Sturgis plays the lead, and then Kate Beckinsale plays Eliza Graves, and we had a lot of other great. David Thewlis was in it. I mean, there was such a great cast in that movie. There's all these Brits that I was so excited to work with, particularly David Thewlis, because I always admired his work. But having Michael Caine like step on the set, he played one of the inmates at the asylum. It was pretty wild, man.
Yeah.
And him and Ben Kingsley hadn't done a movie together. So they had done one movie, like a Sherlock Holmes movie back in the 70s together. Like one played Watson, one played Sherlock Holmes or something. And so they hadn't seen each other in like 20 years. And it was just like a little reunion for them. It was kind of cool. But yeah, so that was Stonehurst Asylum, which, my big disappointment with that film is that Millennium, the company that made it, just took a dive with that one. The movie tested well. You do the NRG tests, and they do all the marketing and all that, and it did. They were happy with how it was doing in terms of that department. But then I think when it came to releasing it and putting it out there and really putting some money behind its release, they didn't do it like they should have, and the movie just didn't see the light of day, unfortunately. Which it could have, but they didn't put enough into it. So you win some, you lose some, but I'm still proud of that film. It's like what we did again on a fairly modest budget in terms of creating a world set in like 1880s, Victorian England. Was pretty good. I thought we pulled it off pretty well. Great cast too. Yeah.
And it has sort of a career connection for you on a sense to Session 9. I mean, in a asylum, right? But it's a totally different story, though.
Dude, yeah. That seems to be my thing. I'm just the asylum. I've done I've done 3 films. No, I've done Session 9 was set at an abandoned mental hospital in Boston.
There you go.
And Stonehurst Asylum is set at a mental hospital, lunatic asylum, and then the other movies aren't set at asylums, like Fractured, for instance, but it may as well be because the guy is essentially mentally ill. So like mental illness and like people who have lost their minds, whether they're at asylums or not, tends to be a thing that I gravitate to.
Could be a Brad Anderson film.
Yeah, if you got some story about a crazy person, send it my way, man. And I don't know. I guess for whatever reason, I enjoy that world. Like I've always some of my early influences, or at least filmmakers I've admired, are like Roman Polanski or Kubrick or Hitchcock. Like filmmakers who are walking that line between madness and sanity. You know what I mean? Like, what is it? I think of a movie like Repulsion, which is to me like perfection. Like I think that movie is like the epitome of like a portrait of madness, and I think that's interesting to sort of visually try to convey. That's kind of what we were trying to do in Fractured, frankly. So yeah, I mean, for a
That's
guy, his first few
yeah.
films were about romance and romantic comedies, and they were sort of driven by bossa nova soundtracks and all that. Like,
Yeah.
I've departed from that. The thing is, though, I've got like any filmmaker you talk to, I'm sure like they talk about the movies they've done, but then that's like a pyramid, right? There's the apex is the films you actually completed and got out into the world, and then beneath it is this giant structure of multiple film projects that either haven't ever gotten out there or are in the process of trying to get out there. So I've got like dozens of different projects I've tried to get made over the years, and then now sort of still in the process of trying to get made. And like one of them, for instance, is a Brazilian bossa nova musical set in Brazil in the 60s. It's like a love story. It's like very much in the vein of my first couple movies, which I've been trying to get made for years. It's like one of my passion projects, nothing to do with mental illness, that one. And then, and then I have a period film set in Peru in the 18th century. That's like an adventure story. I have another one that's based on a Jack London story. So you have all these different interests. Getting them made is the trick, right? I mean, we don't all have the luxury of just being able to, call up the money guys and boom, you're off and running. So I spend a lot of my time, when I'm not doing a television show or actually making a movie, trying to get the financing, which is usually driven by the cast, together so that the movie can get materialized and get made, right? Like right now, I've got a project that I'm out to an actor, and if he says yes, we're making, you know what I mean? Like, so it's like, you always have something stewing. But if I had made just a fraction of all the movies I wanted to make, I would have I would have so many more things on my roster, different types of movies and different types of genres.
Right, different genres, because you're constantly, and this is the struggle, right? Because no matter how many films you get asked to make, there's the huge pile of development that you have of your own that you're waiting to make, and it's endless.
Exactly. And frankly, like it's not always like you end up making the movie that you wanted to make at the time you wanted to make it. Sometimes you just jump on a project because it's happening then and you're going to do it. Other times, like something will come down the pike that you weren't even expecting, and suddenly you're making that movie. Like, some of it's driven by the economics and the financial aspects of it, and some of it's driven by like an opportunity. A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush kind of thing, right? Like I'm rather be making a movie than sitting around, passing on projects in order to get the perfect passion project off the ground. Like I can't afford to do that, So
Right.
on the one level, like I sometimes I'm a gun for hire. On another level, I always have my 2 or 3 dream projects that I'm trying to get made up as well. And hopefully at some point they will, they do, but it takes time.
Right. And wind the clock back to Sundance when the first big sale happens. This is like what, Next Stop Wonderland, right?
98, yeah.
I mean, we're both compadres with similar people, but Laura Bernieri was a good friend of mine as well.
Right.
And I know she was on your stuff, and I know there's a great story behind. There's always a great story back then about how it all came down. So why don't you tell me the Next Stop Wonderland story?
Well,
How it all. This is a good era at Sundance.
It was a good time for like movies like that, right? Like smaller independent films. People wanted to see these kinds of movies. Next Stop Wonderland was a romantic comedy, or is a romantic comedy that I made back in the late 90s. It's my second movie. My first movie, called The Darien Gap, a little, as I said, indie guerrilla style movie made on credit cards, was at Sundance a couple of years earlier, and that kind of got me. I met some people in Boston who had some money. One of them was a producer named Mitchell Robbins, or a money guy. He was a real estate guy. Ultimately, that's what he does. But he had money and he wanted to get in the movie business. So he and his friend Laura Bernieri were like, "Why don't you why don't you do another movie here in Boston, and we'll make it. And so they commissioned me and my friend to write a script. So we wrote Next Stop Wonderland, which was kind of a romantic comedy that was stewing in my head, set in Boston. And
Wonderland's a subway stop.
yeah, well, Next Stop Wonderland is a thing you will hear if you take the Blue Line in Boston. If you're heading out towards the airport, Wonderland Station is one of the stops along the way. So it was kind of the last scene in the movie. It makes sense when you see the movie, the last scene in the movie. But that movie we made, Mitchell Robbins, he financed the film, shot it in Boston. Hope Davis was in that one. Phil Hoffman is in it. It's got a nice little cast. And so it then went on to, it got into Sundance in '98. And we premiered it there before the film festival even started. They wanted to show it to the various powers that be, including Harvey Weinstein and Miramax and Sony Classics and all the players. And so I remember going to that screening. It was so nerve-wracking because it was the first big, for me, like the first big screening with lots of big players in the audience. And would they buy the movie or not, right? Like, that's what you want. I mean, ultimately you want people to see your movie, but when you're at Sundance, you also want your movie to get purchased so that it goes out into the world and people will see it. So anyhow, Harvey saw the movie, and all the other guys, Mark Gill, who I mentioned before, saw it. They loved the film. A couple other companies were really into it. There's a little bit of a bidding war that went on as it is, but ultimately Miramax ended up buying that movie. But in the process of making the deal, like, you know, I mean, I wasn't part of this, but I was privy to it. And that whole process of like negotiating the price and how much the movie's going to cost and all that at a hotel room up at Steiner's Lodge and
Stein Eriksen. Yeah.
Stein Eriksen Lodge. Right. And just like hearing them talk about your movie, like, okay, okay, this will put down this much for the prints and advertising and blah, 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 and all that kind of negotiating that went on. And I'm just sitting there like a terrified, clueless spectator to all the business side of things, which I knew nothing about. I was just thrilled that someone was interested in taking the movie and doing something with it. But then it was really about money and like, oh my God, how much is we're going to pay for the movie? And oh man, it was nerve-wracking and exciting at the same time. Because to me, it was like basically the start of what became my career, because when Miramax buys your movie, they give you like a picture deal, right? So I got like what they called like a 3-picture deal to like do other movies with Miramax. And they would release the film, which they ultimately did after they forced me to make multiple changes to the ending, which sucked. And that was the classic story of Harvey Weinstein, like sitting in a room with him and you're watching your movie with him. And he's like, this suck, lose this, cut this, change that and move that there, you know, literally telling you how to cut your film. It was terrifying. I didn't have the balls back then to like be like, I'm not going to do it. I mean, I resisted, but ultimately I did most of what he wanted me to do. It wasn't terrible, but it was still weird. And then he wanted us to reshoot the ending. The original ending of the movie ended on a high note of ambiguity, whether these two people in the movie who had been meeting throughout would finally meet and get together, right? And you ended with the possibility of that happening, which to me was very elegant and beautiful and simple. And he thought it was too ambiguous. He wanted it to be more clear cut. They meet, they talk, and it's clear that they're going to be a thing. And so we had to shoot this cornball ending of the two characters meeting on a bench and talking and sort of finding common things that they liked about each other. And it seemed really corny. And it was. And that ultimately was the movie that I had to put on the ending of the movie, the ending of the film. And that's the ending that's in the film now. But I thought the original ending was much better. But, you know, at the end of the day, I was not going to, you know, there were like, you know, if you don't do this, then we're not going to release the film. It was that kind of bullshit, right? That's the kind of thing that can hang over your head. You're just a director who doesn't know what the hell's going on. You're like, well, I'm not going to give up the possibility of them putting my film out there. So I'll play ball as much as I can. So I had to, and I did. I don't regret it, but I also feel like it taught me a lot about how the business works and the bullshit aspects of the business. And so they did release the film, and it did okay. And, you know, and it opened up doors for me in many ways. And it gave me the so-called 3-picture deal with Miramax, which ultimately ended up being nothing for me, because like the 3 or 4 projects we tried to get off the ground together, like never got off the ground, and ultimately it ended up stymieing my career because like I couldn't do other things until I had satisfied my Miramax like requirement of like doing another movie with them, which actually never happened. You know, it was a weird time too, you know, because I just wanted to make films. I wasn't going to sit around and wait for like them to greenlight one of my projects. Like it took too long. I just was eager to do it. So I made that movie Happy Accidents in between my deal with Miramax. I was like, fuck, I'm not going to sit around waiting to get a movie off the ground with Miramax. They didn't want to make that one. So I just went ahead and did it on my own, you know.
What a fun film. I mean,
huh?
what a fun film Happy Accidents is. I mean,
yeah, no, that was a fun film. And I you know, I really wanted to do something again. Like I just done Next Stop Wonderland, and I wanted to do a film that was like, you know, in that vein, but this one was more, a little more like kooky and science fiction-y. And so, but again, like I said, like I brought that movie to Miramax. I was like, this, what about this one? You know, let's do this next. Because they would have made it per our deal, but they didn't want to do that one. So I was like, well, what does that mean? I can't do the movie now? Like and they're like, you can do it, but then the next one you got to do with us. So it became this whole sort of process of like not being able to pursue projects I loved because I had this so-called deal with Miramax, which seems like a good thing, but it's only good if you find projects that they're going to greenlight and do with you. If you couldn't, then you're just sitting there and it doesn't result in any, it's not productive. I mean, it would have been nice if we had made another movie together with them, but that didn't happen. So anyhow, Miramax was early, they were the big player back then, right? I mean, that was, you know, before all this shit went hit the fan as it has. But Miramax was like, you go to Sundance and like, it was all about like, if Harvey showed up, right, and his with all his people in tow, that was like, they were like the luminaries at that festival. And when they saw your movie, if they liked your movie, you were set, you know. Think of all those people like Kevin Smith, Ed Burns, like all of their like the way that their careers were accelerated by Harvey's blessing. That's what you wanted back then.
Yeah, they were launched. Yeah, absolutely. And Happy Accident was such a fun theme because of the D'Onofrio character. That guy is like what he uncovers, what you uncover is so great, so much fun to watch. Go back in time a little bit for me now, way back, because I know very little about the young Brad Anderson in Madison, Connecticut. But how the hell did you get into this mess? Coming out of your years growing up in Southern Connecticut and your family, it seems like you had some connections to the business. Always curious to hear about those stories.
Time travel back to the early years.
Time travel.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, I guess how does anyone fall into what they do? I mean, it's not that interesting, only in that like I'd always had an interest in movies. I used to, you know, this was before any kind of simple digital camera kind of technique, but the first movies I made were little Super 8 movies, right? Little Super 8 cameras, and I used to make little movies with my friends, and you know, with the 3-minute mags, you know, and send it up to Kodak, and you get it back, and you like cut it together in a tiny little like mini, you know, Steenbeck, and you made these little films. They were these little movies I made with my GI Joes. I mean, the silly stuff, but exciting when you were, you know, young and you were exploring like what that could be. So that kind of was literally my first filmmaking, was like when I was young, teenager, whatever, you know, influenced by all the usual suspects, Star Wars, you know, anything Spielberg did, right? I mean, it was pretty straightforward kind of like cinema that was inspirational back then. It wasn't anything that like off the beaten path, but definitely interested in it. But ultimately, like, you know, as I got older and went to college and all that, I wasn't really interested. I didn't see myself as getting into the film business. I studied in school anthropology and Russian. I had nothing to do with movies, but I'd always been interested in actually nonfiction film, like making documentaries, and that kind of was interesting to me. So I ended up after college, I ended up going to a film school in London called London Film School. There's two there. One was the International School, and one was the London Film School. I went to the London International Film School. A lot of people from all over the world. At a big old converted banana warehouse in Covent Garden, and really like soup to nuts kind of how to make a movie, like how to load a camera, how to hang a light, how to cut film. This is film, of course. And it was kind of cool. It was a 2-year program. I opted out after the first year because I was like, I'm going to throw all this money into year 2. I'm not going to walk away with a degree. I'm just going to walk away with more knowledge. But why don't I take that money that I would have put into my second year at London Film School and make a movie? So I didn't go back to London. I ended up moving to Boston and took the money I would have used, say, for my second year there, whatever, and pumped it into like making my own little indie film, which is pointless to talk about because it was bad, but it was like my own thing. I was learning, right? I wrote it, directed it, edited it. 16 millimeter film.
And this is before Daring Gap. It was
this was before Daring Gap.
Yeah.
This was like the early 90s. And then so I was now thinking to myself, this could be kind of cool. Maybe I could do some filmmaking. I was really sucked into it via the editing process. Editing was what interested me initially because you could do it. I worked as an editor in other people's movies. There was a couple film editing places up in Boston. Remember that place, Boston Connection, where they'd rent out Steenbecks? I worked there for a while. And,
absolutely, the Codys.
Yeah, and had a lot of connections with various editors and got jobs as assistant editors in different projects and working on student films and that stuff, mainly as an editor, and really liked that process because it was just me and the thing and didn't involve like needing to squire together a whole crew and money and all that, right? But while I was doing that and learning the ropes in that way, I also started to think about, well, I was interested in like making my own movie. And so I started to write a script and cobble together some ideas. And my dad, when I was a kid, another way I got into making those Super 8 movies, because when I was a kid, like a lot of people our age, like the way your childhood was documented wasn't on Super VHS or High 8 or anything. It was Super 8 film. My dad took dozens or if not hundreds of Super 8 movies of us as kids. So there's lots of this Super 8 footage I had in a big box in the attic. And I remember looking through that stuff one Christmas and just kind of going, wouldn't it be cool to take these old Super 8 movies and weave them into a scripted movie that I write and shoot? And the Super 8 movies, my Super 8 movies, can be flashbacks of this character's childhood. Like the movies would become the flashbacks, the actual Super 8 movies. And so that idea percolated, and I wrote this script, and this became my movie, The Daring Gap. This was the first feature I did. And I shot that film in Boston in mid-90s. And this was, again, like, as I said, a real guerrilla style, like credit card movie. I shot it on credit cards. I used some money I had. I inherited a little money. I blew all that on the movie. I put together a financial thing so friends could invest in the movie. And it was all bullshit, but it was just enough to raise the money to get off the ground. And we shot the film on 16 millimeter short ends, right? Like the little pieces of film that they don't use.
Remember it well.
Yeah. And I cast my friend in it, and like no professional actors. It was a really like, it was like a Mike Figgis. You're talking about Mike Figgis. It was like a Mike Figgis movie, or Mike Lee movie or something, you know, like totally improvised. The whole thing was made up. But anyhow, I edited it together. And as I said, I cut together my old Super 8 home movies into the movie that we shot. And it was kind of really, it kind of came out pretty well. It was it's sort of like a slacker comedy in a way, but it had a little heart to it, a little soulfulness to it. And, you know, it got into, that movie was my first, it got into the Sundance Film Festival, into the competition, no less. And I was just like, holy shit, back in 1996. And I had no idea what that even meant, but I knew it was a big deal. So that was the first time I had ever been to a film festival with even a movie, right? And the movie played at Sundance, and like no one bought it or anything, but it did, like, you know, people, it gave me some connections. It got me an agent, right? It got me an agent at William Morris, and that helped open up other doors. So, you know, it was poetic for me in the sense that I used my dad's old Super 8 home movies and incorporated his work into my first film. And it was kind of a nice way to follow that line of he ultimately was probably the inspiration for me wanting to pick up a Super 8 camera, and ultimately became a filmmaker. And I used the movies that he made into my first movie, and it helped launch my career. I know he was very proud of that. So that was probably like how I got into it, you know. I don't think I ever thought of myself as a film director, right? I thought of myself in the sense of a filmmaker. Like, I'm going to make movies. I'm going to just do the process of making the movies. The directing is part of that, right? But it's not the only thing that interests me about it. Because even the music I worked on the music and the score and all that stuff, you know. I loved all that stuff. So it wasn't just the directing part.
You did the score for Darien Gap, or you had a composer, or how did that work?
I had a friend who composed it. We sort of worked on it together in a way. But ultimately, but that's kind of how I got into it. It was a little bit by happenstance, you know. I didn't work my way up the little hierarchical ladder by becoming like a PA and then an assistant director and then a director. I didn't do the sort of traditional route. I just started making movies, and like they were little, small, no budget movies, and some of them didn't even lead to anything, and a couple did. So it was just really the process of doing it. I liken it to sort of like indie, like DIY music in a way. It was like a dude sitting in his garage with like a 4-track and like a little sampler and just making cool music. Like, that's what I was wanting to do with the movie thing. It wasn't like going and becoming part of the business or the industry. It wasn't really even a thought. And it still isn't, because I don't think of myself as being in the industry. I think of myself, like, if anything, working very much on the margins. But I like, you know, you dabble in it, but I certainly don't want to be like, I'm not like any kind of industry, corporate, show business person. It's always been, for me, like, I do it because I love doing it. It's the passion of it, as you know. It's not like I'm doing it for anything other than that. I mean, look, television is a different thing. TV is like about, it's a more of a corporate driven, like, it's a job. But the movies are a little different for me. Like, each movie is its own little journey or whatever, you know, that's worth taking, I think.
And your current film, is it Blood? Which is the one
Yeah.
is that done, or is it in post? What's going on with that?
Yeah. So my latest film is called Blood. And I'll let you. It's a
Sounds
dark.
like a Brad Anderson title to me.
Yeah, I mean, it is. The one before it was Fracture. Now it's Blood. So you can see where it's all going. It's just people in accidents, bleeding out. Now this one's actually, it's blood, but it's a sort of dual meaning. It has a vampire theme to it, I'll admit. There's a little bit of that, although it's not a genre movie. It's more of a family like drama. But it's also about the blood that connects us, like, you know, you're my blood, you know, like, you're my family, I'm related to you. And it's about a mother whose young son gets bitten by a dog and develops a propensity for human blood, but not in a vampire way. Like, it's almost like a medical condition, like as if he needs the blood to survive. And she's a nurse at a hospital, so she gets into a situation where she has to like be stealing plasma to bring home to feed her son. It gets really twisted, but it's not like he's out there like a vampire with fangs and all that. It doesn't adhere to the genre conventions. It's a little offbeat. So Michelle Monaghan is in that, and she's great. And that movie we finished a few months back, did finish the post. And now we're going to Berlin with it, I think, in February, to try to, you know, it's an indie. It was made independently, and they'll try to sell it and do the usual 9 yards, you know. But yeah, it came out good. Shot that one in Winnipeg as well. Seems to be my go-to place. If I'm not in Winnipeg, I'm in Vancouver, because
That's where they're popular places to shoot. Yeah,
that's where all the television is. Like 70 or 80 productions going on in Vancouver.
crazy. And then do you have specific people that you work with consistently in visual effects and all that kind of stuff, or what's your
people I've worked with? There are some that I've worked with on different projects again and again, but not anyone totally consistently. Like, and even with like directors of photography or production designers, like, I try to find ways to collaborate with people I've collaborated with before that I like and that it works out. but often they're working or whatever, and it doesn't work out. But I have some go-to people that I love to work with if I can, but I think everyone's always looking for work, and
Yeah, it's busy
sometimes
time.
it's
Yeah,
kinda go on.
yeah. Yeah. Of course. I mean, that's the challenge. You can't always have the same crew and the same people working for you. But
Yeah,
but this, your career is like absolutely amazing because you've got so much that you've accomplished in both features and television. You keep rocking back and forth, and
yeah.
do you ever get pulled into other parts of the content world? Do you ever get asked to direct commercials or other weird stuff, or do you not have time in your life to do that?
I mean, I probably could make time. I don't. I've done one commercial in my life for a sleep medication, and it was like it's a very bizarre experience. Didn't really like it. When you have 15 executives all watching you shoot a close up of like a pill jar or something. It's not my world. I don't. I mean, I'm sure there are other kinds of commercials, but it's just not like my thing. Um, so I flirted with it briefly long ago and didn't pursue it. So I wouldn't really see myself doing that. But yeah, not really other things. I mean, to me, it's like, I mean, played around with doing some webisode type things but I just find that, I don't know, I'm more of a conventional person when it comes to like storytelling. And I want to sit in a theater and watch a movie. I
Right.
want to watch a 90-minute to 120-minute movie in a theater that
Right.
has a beginning and middle and end. If not, then I'm watching a great television show, but I don't really have a lot of, kind of connections with other new medium. I don't know.
And what do you feel now about the relaunch of theater going? Are you feeling positive? It seems like it's coming back.
I
Movie
just went and
theaters.
saw West Side Story opening night last Friday. Theater was packed. It was
Yeah.
IMAX and 68th Street, Lincoln Square, which was cool because the West Side Story is set literally around the theater that we saw, like 68th and Broadway, and the theater was packed, man. It was like, and this is probably a lot of those people's first time going to see a movie because it's Spielberg. It
Yeah,
is
of
coming
course.
back. I mean, I've been going to movies consistently for the past 6 months, whenever they started opening.
Right.
I'm purposely going out as much as I can to see movies in theaters because I enjoy that experience more than sitting at home watching on Netflix, and just to get out of the house and see a film. You know what I mean? You can't match that experience, and also because it's not terribly crowded. You know what I mean? Because not as many people are going. It's not like crazy at the theater. So I think it's coming back. I've seen a few movies the past 2 weeks, and the theater's always been pretty crowded, and it seems kind of normal.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I hope so. I hope it. I mean, I can't imagine that a world in which you couldn't go see a movie in a movie theater. I mean, that seems hard to believe, but
No. I think it's there. I think that the thing that shifted is just the windows that are being offered for films that are being released on streaming, and how long they make the theater going an exclusive opportunity. Is it an
yes,
exclusive thing to go to the cinema because you got to see something that's not available to see day and date? And to me, that's sort of the magic of what's kept the movies alive and exciting, and the
yeah.
theaters alive and well, right? Yeah.
I think it's a great solution. Like force people to see it first in the theaters, and then if they want to wait, then they'll have to wait to see it on on their television.
Exactly right. And amazingly enough, I as you can see, I live in a high light exposure apartment because the sun is coming at me and I'm about to turn and melt.
You look
I
like
feel
it.
like when my
You're kind of
producer
glowing,
when
man.
my producer sees this, he's going to say, Charlie, there's this thing
Get a
called
blind.
level or blinds. Pass it on.
Yeah,
You, you look like you're glowing.
you have
And
an
I mean, it
aura
does. I mean,
around you.
yeah, but it's good. I mean, it
Yeah,
provides
it's
a
good.
little
You
bit of
look young
contrast.
and healthy and vibrant.
Thank you so much for being on this
Yeah, it was
episode,
fun.
bro. Good catching up. And and stay in touch. And this was great. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Great talking to you, Charlie.
All right, buddy.
All right. Talk soon.
The Pod Matrix.